and welcome back to another episode of Doodling Through Education. For all of my CC students, this is week 21. So we're getting near the end of the year, which is great. And today we have a history episode. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. So I'm going to primarily focus on how the Cold War started, and then we're going to talk about how it ended, as well as how British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and American President Ronald Reagan impacted this time period. As always, remember, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode of Doodling Through Education. On that note, let's start doodling. Let's first start by talking about what the Cold War was and why it began. To do this, let's look back at World War II. You'll notice that the United States and the Soviet Union both fought on the Allied side against the Axis powers. Although they were allies, it was still a very tense situation between the two countries. Americans had been very concerned about communism and the way that Stalin was ruling the Soviet Union. So then, after the war, Americans started to fear the Soviet Union's expansion into Eastern Europe and worried that communism was beginning to take over the world. The Soviet Union also distrusted and resented the United States, specifically for their late entry into World War II, as well as their inability to treat the Soviet Union as a major player in the international community. Most American officials agreed that the best defense against the Soviet threat was a strategy called containment. Diplomat George Kennan explained the policy when he wrote that the Soviet Union was a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the U.S. there can be no permanent modus vivendi, which is an agreement between parties that disagree. It must be the policy of the United States, he declared before Congress in 1947, to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by outside pressures. This way of thinking then shaped American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The containment strategy also provided the rationale for an unprecedented arms buildup in the United States. This called for a 4-fold increase in defense spending. In particular, American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons like the ones that had ended World War II. So then began a deadly arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested an atom bomb of their own. In response, President Truman announced that the United States would build an even more destructive atomic weapon. This was to be called the hydrogen bomb, or super bomb. It was at this point that Stalin then followed suit. As a result, the stakes of the Cold War were dangerously high. The first hydrogen bomb test in the Marshall Islands showed just how scary the nuclear age could be. It created a 25 square mile fireball that essentially vaporized an island, blew a huge hole in the ocean floor, and had the power to destroy half of Manhattan. Subsequent American and Soviet tests then spewed radioactive waste into the atmosphere. This ever-present threat of nuclear warfare had a great impact on American life at home as well. People ended up building bomb shelters in their own backyards. They practiced attack drills in schools and other public places. The 1950s and 1960s saw an increase in popular films that depicted nuclear devastation and mutant creatures. In these and other ways, the Cold War was a constant presence in Americans' everyday lives. People at this time then also began to become worried and feared that there were even communists living among them, and paranoia took control in society, which caused many people to unfortunately be falsely accused of being communist sympathizers. So let's move on now and get to talking about Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War. As Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency, he was greatly troubled by what he saw around the world. For more than 3 decades, the U.S. and its allies had tried to contain communism through a series of diplomatic, economic, and military initiatives. And this had cost hundreds of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives. Yet, communism still gripped the Soviet Union, Eastern and Central Europe, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea. It had even spread to sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua. Whatever its early success, this policy of containment clearly no longer worked. Reagan had determined that the time had come for a new strategy. He was quoted with saying, "We win and they lose." A key element of Reagan's victory strategy was the support of anti-communist forces in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, and Cambodia. This was referred to as the Reagan Doctrine and was the most cost-effective of all the Cold War doctrines, only costing the United States less than $1 billion a year, while forcing the Soviets to spend much more, clocking in at about $8 billion annually to deflate its impact. It was also one of the most politically successful doctrines in Cold War history. Ronald Reagan effectively forced the Soviet Union to abandon its goal of world communism by challenging its legitimacy, regaining superiority in the arms race, and using human rights as a powerful psychological weapon. Now let's talk about Margaret Thatcher. She took office after the Conservative Party won a victory in the May 1979 general election in Britain. She faced vast challenges, though Ronald Reagan's 1980 U.S. electoral victory gave her much strength. Reagan and Thatcher first met in 1975, and both leaders immediately recognized that they shared the same fundamental principles. As leaders of great and independent nations, they decided to act together and agreed on the major challenges of the 1980s. Like Reagan's vision, Thatcher's vision was one of hope. She had a great faith in the West and believed that the Cold War could be won and that the Soviet Union would not last forever. She believed that the inhumanity of its system would be its eventual downfall. Even more eagerly than Reagan, she looked for a Soviet leader who recognized that its system, if confronted by a strong West, could never win. Gorbachev, the Soviet president at the time, wanted to reform the communist system, not end it. But as Thatcher and Reagan recognized, once communism began its downfall, it was doomed. Their faith in liberty brought strength to the West, destruction to the Soviets, and a peaceful victory in the Cold War. And that's all we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and you learned a lot more about the Cold War, as well as how Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan impacted it. Remember to continue learning always. So go out through this week and learn more about the Cold War. Talk with your parents and your siblings and your classmates about this. And on that note, remember to be kind, follow God's will, and take care. Bye.